Welcome to Barry's in the Interim podcast, where we explore the cutting edge of innovative clinical trial design for the pharmaceutical and medical industries, and so much more. Let's dive in.
Welcome back to In the Interim. I'm Scott Barry, your host, and welcome everybody back. We're another interim analysis. So today's topic, and it is a really hard topic to sort of talk about, but I'll introduce it by introducing the first time I met my father-in-law. You'll wonder where this is going. So I was dating my wife, and we went down to the farm in Iowa. He was a farmer in Iowa, crops and hogs. And the first time I met him, and I was just graduating college and just making plans to go to graduate school in statistics. And he's a farmer, and the first time he met me, the very first question he ever asked me, it wasn't anything, was I going to be good to his daughter? And by the way, we were not engaged at this point. The very first thing he asked me was, why would a farmer in Iowa care about statistics? And to many of you out there, you'll recognize this. This is a layup question. This is a question we dream about. Now, I was an undergraduate who was good at probability, and I was pretty good at math. Despite having a father who was a statistician, I was naive. I didn't know a lot about statistics. I certainly knew the history and the development of statistics was largely through agriculture. Much of Fisher's work was agricultural and experiments, in important part. I'm in Iowa, where Iowa State was a huge academic center and developer of statistical methods. So this is a layup question, but now I'm explaining to somebody who's a farmer. He's going out and he's combining and he's planting and he's raising hogs. He doesn't care about Bayesian. He doesn't care about frequentist. He doesn't care about hypothesis testing. What does it do to a farmer? Now, I'm sure I fumbled the answer. I remember the question. I don't really remember my answer. But given this, and now if I had the chance to re-answer the question, I think I could do a much better job with answering it, but I'm sure I fumbled it. Now, I didn't fumble it enough that I wasn't able to eventually marry his daughter. And I've talked about Tammy on this show many times. By the way, if you're watching on the video, she hates that I put the headphones with one ear open like that. So maybe I'll do this so she thinks it doesn't look quite as bad. But the point of this is it now very technical, and I was good at math and I was good at this. Now I have to explain to a farmer what statistics does for him. And he wants it in his language about the amount of cost to plant, how much the reward you're going to get from that come time to combine and reap the size of the reward at the end, the price for this, what crop to plant, how to plant it, how to rotate it, lots of things that tremendously experimented on, and we understand that. And how do we learn what the right answer to this is? I think I could talk to him in his language about what it means to him with dirty boots and how a statistician could be helpful. Similar discussions I have with my brother, my older brother, Don, same name as my father. He's a professional golfer. And many times we have this conversation: what could a statistician do to help a professional golfer? It's kind of interesting because there's been a huge explosion in the quantification of golf. These guys all know all their numbers. They know their shots gained. Tremendous. There's been a huge explosion. 15, 20 years ago, the statistical analysis of golf, it was poor. It was quite poor. But now it's tremendous, and I think much easier discussion. But explain to somebody who's hitting a golf shot what you can do for them in their language of that. So coming to this question about statistical communication, how do we communicate with people? And I did a podcast with Jenny Davenport from Roche, and she spends a huge amount of time on this communication and talked about it and how do you talk to C-suite people? So I want to dive into this topic and talk a little bit about it. And I will, from the front, I will say this is a hard topic. It's one I continually try to strive to do better. I don't know if I'm good at it. I try hard at it. It's incredibly important. We can do incredible things statistically or quantitatively. If we can't communicate or get buy-in for it, then it doesn't do any good. And so you could be an incredibly talented mathematical statistician, and if you can't communicate what it means to a farmer, to a golfer, what does it mean? So I want to talk a little bit about this, and it's a scary thing to talk about. And as a statistician, okay, I'll refer to myself. The things I'm very self-conscious or have been very self-conscious about over time is, and probably three things that a lot of people share this, is how we write. Writing is really, really hard. And I don't know if anybody really thinks they're good at it. I think my father, Don's a tremendous writer. I think he works really, really hard at it. How we communicate, so how we teach, how we present, something we're very self-conscious about, and how we code. I think we're really uncomfortable if people read our code. They might figure out we don't actually know what we're doing, or there's a logic to coding and your logic is bad, and you could do this much better. Things we're self-conscious. So very self-conscious about this. I don't want to come across as arrogant in any way that I'm a good communicator. Things I think about and strive for. And also introducing this topic. So I'm going to present a couple examples that have kind of hit me that I think present this whole idea of communication, scientific communication. And part of it is the fact that the kind of books I read, I tend to read in decent health generally, but I don't necessarily sleep well. So one of the habits I've gotten into, which a good habit, is sometimes my mind is racing and it's hard to sleep. And so I tend to read before bedtime. And I tend to read nonfiction, not necessarily super exciting things. Part of this is these are things I like. I'll read the history. I'll read the story of Wyatt Earp in the 1800s, or different periods of history. The Boys in the Boat. They're essentially nonfiction things, and I'm learning something about it. So I read a book by Alan Alda, the actor, famous for his role in MASH. He wrote a book called "If I Understood You, Would I Have This Look on My Face?" He has spent a tremendous amount of time teaching scientists communication, and he writes a book about it. He really has spent years with academic scientists, other scientists, in the art of communicating. And it's a really interesting book, fairly straightforward, simple read, written very well, as you can imagine. And he talks about the role of empathy in this. And I think that's largely understanding your audience, having empathy for them, and you're presenting something that they're going to get something out of this. Am I presenting everything I know and I'm a super smart guy? What does it mean to the person consuming that? Or am I presenting something that they would enjoy listening to? So I referred to my father, Don. He's a wonderful writer, and I once asked him about writing, and he said, I tend to try to write something that people enjoy reading. And there's a huge part of that empathy for your audience, and he talks about this. He also talks about doing improv, that scientists should do improv, and it adds to your ability to communicate the role, the position you're in. Really interesting. I've never tried that, but a really interesting thing. But he talks about the timing of when the book was written. He talks about the 2016 election with Trump versus Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton. And he contrasts the way each of them speak and communicate and really the different way in which they're perceived. And I, for example, I appreciated Hillary Clinton. I thought she presented things, I understood her, but he presents it very much in a way that a lot of people don't understand necessarily what she was saying. And so she didn't appeal to them as somebody, what do I get out of this? What does it mean to me? The farmer with the boots in the ground, what does it mean? And she didn't appeal or present. It was presented overtly technical, where Donald Trump is not in any way, shape, or form overly technical, and had a different kind of appeal for that. Another wonderful example of this, a book I just finished, so I very much recommend that book, was a very different kind of book, but it was a book called Wingmen, The Wingmen, and it was written by Adam Lazarus, and it's a story of John Glenn and Ted Williams. And it's the subtitle of it is The Unlikely, Unusual, Unbreakable Friendship Between John Glenn and Ted Williams. So John Glenn is the renowned test pilot. He flew combat missions in World War II and Korea. Ted Williams flew combat missions in the Korean War. He was in the middle of his prime for the Boston Red Sox, and he had, in World War II, he had learned to fly. He was a pilot. He never had combat missions, but he learned to fly. He was pulled up by the military, and he became John Glenn's wingman in the Korean War. That they flew in pairs, and his role was to be the wingman for John Glenn. They're very, very different people, and it goes through the history of both of them. And it's a fascinating read. I'm a sports fan, but it's a really interesting read about both the men and the contrast between them, and the unlikely friendship of the two. So he goes through a story where John Glenn, he's a renowned test pilot, by all accounts, very much a Boy Scout. Just good, a good person, does well by others. He is in the military, a hero. He then becomes a Mercury 7 astronaut. So the original 7 astronauts that are setting up to go to the moon. This is early on. The first rocket ships to go into orbit and to orbit the Earth. He's the first in Friendship 7 in 1962. He's the first astronaut to orbit Earth, the first U.S. astronaut to orbit Earth. We were actually slightly behind the Russians, and that was the big rush that we have to beat the Russians to the moon. And this was, everybody's was on this, and there was actually some issues in the Friendship 7. He successfully lands, and he becomes one of the most well-known people in the United States. He's a hero to everybody. He's what everybody wants to be. The book, The Right Stuff, by Tom Wolfe, I also read that, a very interesting read, talks about this whole, the Mercury 7 astronauts and test pilots and the role of pilots in the military. It's a fascinating read. And then it becomes a movie. And the movie comes out in 1983. So the interesting, what is the whole point to this thing? He runs for president in 1984. So he becomes a U.S. Senator from Ohio, a very respected politician. He's an American hero, an astronaut, by all accounts, a Boy Scout. What everybody wants their sons to be, what they aspire to be. Incredibly potential politician. So in 1984, he's a Democrat, and he's running for president, and he doesn't do very well at all. He ends up in Iowa, the first primary, he ends up 5th. On Super Tuesday, he ends up 4th. He ends up dropping out of the race. And Walter Mondale wins the Democratic nominee for president within this, and he gets essentially destroyed by Reagan in the election. But he wins the Democratic primary. Second is Gary Hart. who you can go back and look, and he ends up being caught with a mistress, and despite daring people to find if he's unfaithful, and then they do. But John Glenn, this incredible American hero, ends up fifth and ends up fourth overall in this. So how does this happen? How does somebody who is such a perfect candidate to be president end up, not even competitive within this? And so you can look, and this book goes through it and talks about it. By the way, he asked Ted Williams to endorse him, and Ted Williams is a staunch Republican, and he doesn't. And Ted Williams, late in life, says it's one of the biggest regrets in his life that he's a huge fan, and John Glenn is a hero, and he didn't endorse him because he was a staunch Republican and a Nixon fan, and it's sort of a really interesting read. But largely the book says it's because of his communication. And even Glenn acknowledged this at the time. He's giving a talk in Alabama, and his son is an anesthesiologist. And he says, my son puts people to sleep like father, like son. So he admits that he's not a very good speaker. And largely this book goes through and says he's very much a technician and an engineer, very smart guy. And he's describing the detail. He's like a scientist, describing all of the details of policy, and none of it appeals to the voter. What does that mean to me? Where Reagan is very different than that. Reagan is appeals to the voter, and they understand what it means to them as the voter. It's a very similar situation. And so in many ways, he was a bit of a poor speaker. He didn't communicate well to his audience, which in running for president at the time are the voters. And he's essentially playing this role of the scientist in all of this, and we can all sort of take some lessons to that. Are we talking about the technical details where somebody says, if I had this look on my face, would I understand what you're saying? Do I understand what that means to me and the decisions I have to make? The last example, also coming from a book through this, it's a very interesting book called Ada's Algorithm, and it's a story of Ada Lovelace and her relationship with Charles Babbage, and she has a really interesting history with William Blake, and a really interesting book about her being sort of the for scientist for software, even though there is no computer at the time, and that's sort of part of the story. She was apparently brilliant and understood the ramifications potentially of the Babbage machine, more so than Babbage even. So it's a very interesting read in her role in that. So I take something out of this where he had built this idea for the analytical engine after what was the difference engine, and he wanted to build this analytical engine, which would have been, as they referred to as Turing complete, essentially the first computer ever built, which it would enable the use of software. And this is, in the mid 1800s, he had that ability. He needed funding to build this analytical engine, which would have been unbelievably powerful at the time. And I think, maybe he didn't understand what it would mean to other people. So he had the opportunity to get funding. So on November 11th, 1842, he meets with the Prime Minister of the British government, Sir Robert Peel. And interestingly, at the time, 1842, it's among widespread poverty and hunger in Britain. The struggles, and the Prime Minister's dealing with that. And that's, of course, forefront in his mind is poverty and hunger in Britain. And he's going there to ask for money to build the analytical engine, which could be the forefront and the start of the technical revolution, maybe 100 years before it actually happened within that. So he writes about this meeting as an unmitigated disaster. And I'm largely quoting from this book. By the way, the author of this book is James Essinger within this. So this is from the book. It says, Peel was in no mood to meet Babbage at all, let alone in the mood for a stressful confrontation with a mad scientist. So Babbage writes, first of all, the meeting was conducted in a defensive, sullen, bad-tempered, querulous, self-centered, and self-pitying manner that would only irritate and alienate Peel. But this is the part that I found really interesting. But Babbage, in his bitterness and haste to justify himself, tried quoting to Peel a comment that the mathematician Plana had made that the invention of the analytical engine would provide the same control over the executive Department of Analysis as we have hitherto had over the legislative. Now, I don't fully understand this, but largely it means we would have the ability to have this computing machine that we can provide instructions to, and it's going to compute everything we want it to compute, and describes this of having control over the executive function. A rather famous quote, and this is what Babbage is telling Peel, who's dealing with hunger and famine in 1842 Britain. He's not telling Peel the impact that this would have on people of Britain. What would happen if we have this ability, what it would do to the economy, the impact this would have. And the writer says he should have been to the point, pleasant, and done his utmost to explain his work to Peel in language that presented the practical function to Britain's economy of his invention. Talking to the farmer with his boots in the mud, talking to the golfers hitting golf shots, talking to the prime minister about what it does to the economy of Britain. That's explaining this good communication. John Glenn being able to explain to John Doe voter what it would mean to him if he became president. He was unable to do that. This, in many ways, is the role of us as a scientist. We're doing this very technical work. And in this case, Babbage had this unbelievable machine. The first Turing complete machine wasn't built to 1942, I think it says in there. But he had the possibility of 100 years earlier potentially having this, and it was because of communication that it didn't happen, or at least hypothesized by this. So what does this mean now? What does this mean to a scientist? What does it mean to a statistician? What does it mean to be a good communicator? I harken back a little bit to what Alan Alda talks about empathy. Empathy is understanding what's my audience. What am I talking in their language? When I talk to somebody who's a clinical development lead, am I talking about the advantages of a Bayesian posterior probability to a p-value, which there are many, but he or she doesn't care. Does it change them? Am I communicating to them? I don't want to have that conversation with them. And by the way, occasionally there will be a statistician who will ask that question when I'm really trying to communicate with the clinical development lead about why this adaptive design is better than a fixed design. Sure, it's using Bayesian mechanics, it's doing longitudinal modeling, it's really neat stuff. I'd love to share the details of it, but that doesn't help him or he or she in that scenario. I need to explain in their language what this means. I have to play in their sandbox. I have to be the scientist who understands the quantitative thing, and I do all that work, but that can't be what I communicate. Now, I have to be able to defend that and talk to a statistician, a regulator statistician, a referee at a journal or any of that, and be able to be the best at that. But I have to be able to explain to my audience and have empathy for them, what does this mean for them? Now, in order to do that, I've got to understand, what is their language? What does the farmer care about? What does the professional golfer care about? What does the voter care about? What does the clinical development lead care about in that setting? And I have to speak in that language. I have to understand, what resources are we measuring? What are the constraints? What are the science of the disease? I can't ask them to know all that and then come play in my sandbox and them understand power and them understand statistics, or should we do an MMRM or a t-test or a slopes model? That's not what they're experts at. And if I'm having that conversation and we're talking about that, I've lost. I'm not communicating well. I want to talk about timelines for approval. I want to talk about picking the right dose for go, no go. I want to talk about how this trial helps fund the trial. I want to talk about what it does for the disease or the endpoints and all of that. I'm learning that, and I'm talking in their sandbox, in the setting. So this first kind of came to me where I was designing a trial. It was early on in Berry Consultants, and it was a really nice trial, Bayesian trial, adaptive design, longitudinal modeling, how we figure out an alpha adjustment. Bayesian does nice work in here, and presenting really nice simulations of the trial, multiple trials. We could do this, this, and this. And the person I was presenting to asked me a really simple question that was a bit jarring, said, "What would you do?" And why it was jarring was I didn't know the answer to that. And it wasn't part of my slides. Think about how bizarre it is that I'm presenting multiple designs and I'm sort of being the statistician. I'm in my sandbox. I'm doing really cool stuff. And I'd love to tell a lot of people about how cool it is. Person doesn't care how cool it is. What development plan, what design should we pick? Why it was jarring is I recovered a little bit and I said, I would do this design. But in order to do that, I've got to understand so much about what are the goals of the trial. Why would I pick that design? I ended up going to slide 7 and showing, look, this design, this is what it does in this scenario. And then I go to design 14 and I say, if you saw when I presented this over here on design 14, and you compare that to slide 7, look at how much better this does on resources and time. It gets the right answer. And then you go to slide 21 and you say, look what it does here. So I would pick this one on slide 14 because it does better on this. And realize I don't have that on a slide. How do I not have a slide that shows this design, this is what it does for you, clinical development lead, in your language? I should have that slide. I should be able to answer the most simple question, what would you do? And have the slides presented to do that. And that's what I think communication is, when I'm able to have that discussion in their language. If they're on my side of the field, I'm doing it wrong. They're trying to do my science. And that's a bit of the fear, because in some ways we can really learn and understand what it is they're trying to do. And again, the goals of that. But our presentation needs to be succinct and presented in their language for what they want. We're not candidates for president, but the message is very much similar. What do I do for them, and what does it do for them? What is the resources? What is the performance? Now, I've got to know what the right thing to present is. What performance metric do I present in the design? Is it power under a set of delta? Is it the probability of making the right dose selection and then moving and getting success? And what endpoint? Clinically meaningful? I have to understand the disease. I have to understand the constraints about the different arms so that I can have that conversation in their language. If I haven't done that work or done that part, I can't have that conversation. And I'm speaking in a stale way of math. And then I'm asking that person to interpret it and make decisions based on a bunch of facts that I've given him, which is really, really hard. And that's the stuff we should be doing. Now, this is hard to do, but it's what the wonderful part and it's the challenge of this is. If our role is entirely, they do all the work, they calculate, they think of a delta, they think of an endpoint, the number of arms in the trial, and I just need you to calculate a sample size, that's in a vacuum and I give them a number, I don't think we're doing a good job. I don't think we're communicating well. We're asking everybody else to be statisticians, and all we're doing is calculating. So there are certain things to learn to try to get there. So for example, if I'm ever asked, what sample size do I need in this scenario? The thing I never tell them is 240. I think it's the right answer to the question they don't actually have. But I'm trying to learn a little bit about what are the things that could go wrong? What are they thinking about? How sure are they of this delta? How did they come up with that? I might present a graph that shows power over sample size for multiple effect sizes. And then I circle right there and say 80% power for that is 240. But look, different effect sizes, here's your power. Are you worried about this? Are you worried about that? A bigger sample size, 90% power, does this. And a lot of times now, all of a sudden, they tell me what's going on. They tell me about their concerns, the potential things that maybe the design could mitigate. And maybe it's about the patient population. They don't understand the variability. They told me it's the standard deviation's 3, and they almost create this sort of, I know everything, it's this, this, and this, just give me the sample size. When really I'm trying to learn about all these parts. Now you have to have that interaction. You can't do this where they throw something over the fence and you give a sample size. That's hard to be a good statistician and a good communicator, because when I present to them, I don't know what performance is. I don't know what the metrics are. I don't know anything about the financial constraints. I don't know anything about competitive landscape. Are we racing somebody else? All of these things should go into when I present multiple designs. Here's what it does on those factors important to them. But I have to know what's important to them. So maybe it's a whole separate podcast of trying to learn what's important to them, trying to get anticipated regret after the trial, what success is and all of that. But it's having these conversations in the language that they speak, not statistics. And yes, an example happened to me where somebody came to me with a design for a certain delta, and the sample size of 240, they had 80% power. And yep, this is a good design, and we're presenting alternatives to that design. And I simulated that design under delta, under the thing, and I showed them simulation results. And the individual said to me, wait a minute, if I have that blockbuster effect, 20% of my trials fail? Now, I think most people listening to this will understand, well, that's what power is. But that person didn't actually understand it. To them, power was, oh, that's just something that tells me my sample size, and it's a good trial if it's powered. They didn't necessarily understand that meant if I have that effect delta, the probability we lose this trial is 20%, which is a huge error rate within that for them on something they care about. But showing them simulations, it was blatantly clear in that setting what it meant. And now all of a sudden I'm speaking much more on their side of the fence when I'm showing those simulations and I'm doing that. And we don't want them doing the power. We can make fun of them. They don't know power, but that's our fault. That's our fault for being mathematical, for being way too far on the other side and not communicating and not working and not working on their science. So, it doesn't do any good to say, oh, that person should know power. We don't want to ask them to do the statistics. Don't do presentations that ask them to do that work. Work on their side of the science within that. Now, you have to understand your audience. Are they statisticians that you're talking to? Are they regulators? Are they clinicians? Is it the VP of development? Are they funders that the biotech is asking you to talk to about the design? If your presentation is the same for all of those, you're not doing it right, because all of them have a different understanding. They have different language. They have different science, and we can do that. Being good communicators, being able to speak their language, not asking them to speak ours. And the more you can work on that, it's hard. And it's really hard, and I don't get it right, and I get it wrong. And I told you some of the cases where I did it wrong, but I'm striving to try to do that in those scenarios. And I'm trying to get to that point within it. Now, to me, there's a huge value in this in clinical trial simulations. And why is it a value? I can present a design and analytically it has type 1 error control, and I can say 240 is your sample size. But it doesn't communicate well with that other person. For example, that person who didn't understand power didn't know that 20% of the trials fail on that. If I show them simulation results of what effect size comes out of the trial, and every one of those is a trial, they understand the result of the trial, the person I was speaking to. So here's a trial where it finishes, it does this, and it makes this decision. And this is what it means clinically to you. This is how long it took, and this is the resources it took. Here's the result. This is what it means to you economically. That's incredibly insightful. That's their language. And then I can show them the simulations, and I can do it in any detail they need to speak their language. And simulations are a great tool to do that. I can say, here's an adaptive design that's a promising zone design, and it has this power. They don't understand what that means. Many people don't understand what that design means. Now you show them simulations of the decision it makes, the effect size at that time, what the DSMB would do, what the result is. All of a sudden, oh, I don't like that. Or why does it do this? Or why does it do that? They understand it. It's in their language. So clinical trial simulations, there are a lot of statisticians out there that say, oh, this is for the weak-minded, because they're really good at analytical calculations, and they're probably better at it. But does it enable you to communicate exactly what it is you built as well as you can? Somebody who's going to build a house for somebody shows them pictures of what the house is going to look like. Clinical trial simulations is that tool. I show you a picture. I can show you a movie of the trial you built, which is hugely valuable in communicating in their side of the field, not my side, which the math, and we can talk about conditional power and why below 50%, there's no inflation of type 1 error. We're doing it wrong in that circumstance. But if I'm showing them trial results, that's a great communication skill within that setting. Yes, it's a little bit like I'm a candidate talking to a voter. I'm talking what it means to them. I'm not talking about the details of my healthcare policy, and this is why it's good, and it's Bayesian versus frequentist, and you should like that. They're going to look at me like, okay, what does it mean to me? They don't know what it means to them, and that person's asking a lot of that person to understand and then consume what it means to them, rather than saying this is what it means to you. That's our goal. Hard, but I believe that's good statistical communication to have impact. It also gets this idea that we all strive for, to get a seat at the table. Excuse me. A lot of people say we want to be at the table when the decisions are made, but if you get an opportunity to get to that table, how do you behave? Do you earn a right at the table? And if you're having that communication in the science and the needs of the people at the table to make that decision, when they say, what decision would you make? Are you stuck with, oh, I don't know, and I don't have the right material to show you, or do you have that? That's really the ability for us to have a bigger impact. And I think we have a lot of solutions that can have better impact if we can have that communication to them. So I'm not running for office. I would be a terrible candidate, by the way. I'm not sure I could communicate to the voters at all in that scenario. But I'm striving to be a candidate statistician, trying to communicate better. And hopefully you can get something from this, because you are my audience today, which is a little bit ironic and a little bit hard. Until next time, we'll be here in the interim.